Hi there. I'd like to talk to you about the peace process in El Salvador. Here's a picture of the map of El Salvador with the different provinces. And essentially, this was a long-running, ulcerating guerrilla warfare where a number of groups got together under the name of the FMLN, and they were united only in one thing, in that they wanted profound political change in El Salvador. The right-wing government, supported and financed in many ways by many American institutions, were against the FMLN, and the process was deadlocked until the then Soviet Union decided that it could no longer subsidize its ally Cuba in the Caribbean, and Cuba decided it could no longer subsidize other freedom fighters throughout the Central Americas. That was the big strategic context for this situation. If the Soviet Union had continued subsidizing Cuba, it's highly unlikely that the peace process would have finished. And this is a lesson for all peace processes. If there are powerful patrons outside the country concerned, or the countries concerned, who are determined to keep subsidizing them, then they will fight to the last dollar. It really is as simple as that. But that didn't happen in Salvador. We started to get a peace process going, which ended in the final signatures to the peace in 1992. The Chapultepec Accord signed in Mexico City. But the lead up to that started in 89-90, and by 91 it was a mature process. So the key mediator for the process was the Undersecretary for Peacekeeping in the United Nations, Marek Golding, and this is him. His initials were MIG, and so he was called MIG by those who called him MIG. The only time I met him, I called him Sir, but that's just the way I am. He was an impressive man, he was a very wise man, and most of all, he understood the importance of patience in getting the parties together. So they would fly the key parties on each side to a third country. They would spend a weekend or a couple of days talking or not talking, and then come back. And of course, those of us who had acted as escorts for people that were flying and things like that, all we could think of was the debrief when they got back. You know, what was happening, who was doing, who said what. And for about 12 months, the debrief was really, really simple. The only thing they agreed was they agreed to meet again. And we, at the bottom of the tree looking up, were pretty disheartened by this, but Marek Golding was not. He really saw that so long as they kept meeting, there was hope. And so long as they kept meeting, little grains of sand would be dropped in the glass, and finally the glass would run over with goodwill. And that's exactly what happened, because after a year of what we all thought was inconclusive meetings, they decided that they would start getting down to some serious negotiating, and then they had different groups negotiating different things. There were constitutional issues, there were practical issues, there was human rights issues, and there was, of course, the inevitable post-conflict justice issues, which meant a massive police reform. And here I should say, of all the places that I've done these sort of peacekeeping activities, the only police reform that I think was done at all well was in El Salvador. Not in any of the other much better financed missions, but in El Salvador. So, who are the other key players? This is the government president, Cristiani, Mr. President Cristiani. He was an intelligent man. He was considerable right-wing, yet he was also very pragmatic and realistic. And he sensed, after the money started to run out, because at the same time it became actually clear that the Soviets were no longer subsidizing the Cubans, who then could no longer subsidize the FMLN rebels, the Americans turned around to the government and said, we're not going to subsidize you. We were there actually only to counteract the influence of the Soviet Union. It had not even Cuba was our concern. Our concern was stopping the influence of the Soviet Union. And so both sides ran out of cash and both sides started to negotiate. And Cristiani, in his own way, started to mold his generals into the idea that they weren't going to be able to go on forever and they couldn't fight forever and be demanding the national budget forever, but that an accommodation had to be made. And he understood that. And even though he stuck by right-wing principles and he fought like mad against human rights vetting, there were times when he had to give in and he had to do what was necessary for the peace process. On the other side, this is one of my personal heroes in life. She is, her nom de guerre is Nidia Diaz, and I met her on a number of occasions and talked with her, and I saw her tough as tough with the negotiations, and then at other times I was going to escort her back from a far distant village where she was talking to simple peasants, campesinos, and she couldn't have been a more human figure, talking to them at their level, not condescending to them, but she talked at their level. And she was a fearless fighter. She was wounded, and that's how she was captured. She was tortured for 6 months. When she was talking to us gringos, she would often wear long-sleeved shirt because her arm was so badly scarred from where she had been burnt and tortured for 6 months by the government, and she knew that people would just look at it. So she wore a long-sleeve shirt to make sure that we didn't get distracted by the fact that she'd been put through horrible process. And at the end, she was capable of rising above the torture, above the personal trauma, and she formed part of the, if you like, sensible core on the FMLN side, who said, no, we have to be pragmatic. We can't hang out for absolutely absolutist values. She is fantastic. So Nidia Diaz, a pragmatist, but a very brave woman. President Cristiani never gave up his principles, but understood pragmatism, and he understood he had to get something signed. And this is the party in front of the main cathedral in downtown San Salvador when the provisional agreement was first announced. There's always a provisional agreement and then months of tidying up before you get to the actual signing of the Chapultepec Accords. It was at the end of my time in the mission in El Salvador. We all went down to the square, and the one souvenir you wanted to come away with was a red bandana from the FMLN. And to this day, I have my red bandana from the Chalatenango group that I met down at the square, and it means a lot to me. So, in summary, then, we can say, if we look at the Canavan framework, achieving the ceasefire is essential. It's not easy to do, and if you have really strong supporters outside of the region, very rich supporters who are determined to keep subsidizing the fighters, you will not get the ceasefire. If you get a ceasefire, it'll be broken in bad faith. But as happened in El Salvador, the two key sponsors cut off the money, and that meant that the guys at the table understood that they were running out of time and resources to play. Repetitive meetings. It's very easy to get frustrated and say, oh my God, this is the 8th time we've met, nothing is being done, nothing is being said. If the strategic framework that they're cut off from supplies is understood at the table by each party, what they're doing by meeting is sounding out. And they're also identifying in each party's delegation the irreconcilables and the reconcilables. And the great trick of people like Mr. Marek Goulding is that he was in front of everybody in seeing who could actually come to an agreement and who couldn't, who were the irreconcilables. And he'd find ways when different subjects were being in different places of, for instance, asking if a particular commandante could go to a different subgroup because his expertise was needed there. He was getting him out of the room whilst the framework for the agreement for that particular subgroup on that particular issue was being made. And so the complicated part of this is understanding with experience and expertise who can be reconcilable and who is irreconcilable and about what. Because people are not consistent. There are some who are irreconcilable on everything, and then you've got to go to the government or the FMLN side and you've got to say, look, your man can't be reconciled on anything. Why have you sent him? Are you trying to sabotage these talks? Because he's just objecting to every single thing that there is. And so you're weighing up, assessing the delegations in this process of repetitive meetings, and eventually it starts to work. So one of the things that was most clear in the Salvador process, and even more clear when I've been in peace processes that were much less successful than El Salvador, is the fact that the parties must own the process themselves. So they can only go at the speed that they will go at. You cannot expect one party or the other party to capitulate and just stop concerning themselves about any of the principles that their people have sent them there to look at and to do and to fight for. They have got to get the key things that they wanted. One of the key things that the FMLN stood by, which nobody had really anticipated the strength of their objections to, was that they said that the new police force in the new peace had to be 100% vetted for human rights violations, and that included the FMLN fighters who'd be put up to become part. Some 30% of the new police would be previous FMLN combatants, and if there was any problems with them, they would not be, the individuals would be vetted, and if they couldn't pass the vetting, they could not get into the new police. Any of the existing police, it didn't matter how long they'd been in, they had to all be re-vetted, vetted, and the new police force had to be untainted. That seemed to be a strange thing that became an absolute sticking point for the FMLN, and yet it turned out to be, in my opinion, the single most important thing that was done. Because post-conflict law and order is absolutely fundamental, and you cannot have a morally corrupt police. You cannot have people trying to do law enforcement when the population can point and say, yeah, but he organized the massacre at, and then you fill in the blank of where the massacre was. We haven't done that well in other places. We certainly didn't do it in the Balkans well. There was human rights training. And at the end of certain trainings, I witnessed in the Balkans senior police officers going up to get their certificate. They were awarded their certificate, and in front of the entire audience, they ripped it up and threw it on the floor. So, in El Salvador, it was not like that. In El Salvador, it was serious, and it was one of the big things for the FMLN. It was one of the things that they ensured happened with respect to the future. The government stuck by the thing that even though they agreed to a land reform commission and a land reform process, they had no intention ever of doing that because the key families that kept them in power simply didn't agree to it. And to this day, I don't believe any progress has been made on land reform in El Salvador. So each side wins something, each side loses something. That's the way a good process works. The good negotiator, the good mediator, is aware that there's always a potential for reversion to violent conflict. And that is why expectation management and not allowing any one group or faction within a group to gallop ahead of the agenda is really important. A controlled, steady thing is absolutely important, and the Salvador peace process, because it was mediated by Marek Goulding, was absolutely on the money, and there was never any reversion to violent conflict. So in summary, In the obvious domain, we have the two key sponsors stopping, for different reasons, asymmetric reasons, stopping subsidizing their clients on the ground. On the ground, clients had to get to know each other in a long, slow process of meeting. Eventually, their key issues that they would not compromise on were recognized, and each side went along and got most of what they wanted, but nobody got all of what they wanted. In that respect, I would have to say that the guidance, once the strategic picture had fallen into place of the cutting off the funds, the guidance provided by an experienced mediator like Marek Goulding was simply outstanding. I went to the Balkans and various other places. Nobody drove a peace process as well as Marek Goulding did. And that's really all I have to say about that.